You know, it's sort of strange that by trying to escape or avoid something so much, you actually run into it. It's like staying in to avoid the cold, or working out and exercising, and you get that heart attack you've been trying so hard to avoid. The family in this story, that's exactly what happened to them, in the most horrifying way possible. The Dardeens were fleeing violence. They were fleeing the city, fleeing a life surrounded by an increasing crime rate, and in fact ended up running directly into a horrifying murder scene. Folks, this is a dark ass one, so buckle up, buckaroo. And it takes us to the tiny village of Ena in Jefferson County, Illinois. A small old place in southern Illinois. Today it's home to less than 2,000 folk, and it had a hell of a lot less in it when our story takes place. For much of Ena's existence, ironically, as a place founded from the fallout of one of the biggest atrocities in history, which is the Trail of Tears. If you asked residents about the famous crimes in their community, which, I don't know what kind of question that is, hey, any famous murder? I suppose if you're a true crime guy like I am and we are, it's actually a pretty common question to ask. But if you'd asked the residents of Ena what was the most famous crime, right, that happened in your area, they would have gone all the way back to 1924. See, there was this locally infamous case involving the illicit affair of the Reverend Lawrence Height and one of his parishioners, Elsie Sweeten. Together, the pair conspired to do away with the inconvenient existence of Sweeten's husband in July of 1924, and then 2 months later, in September of 1924, Height's wife. Yeah, they were so in love and having this affair, kill his wife, kill her husband, do dirties together. However, an autopsy brought about by the suspicious timings revealed the presence of arsenic in both victims' systems. And, gossip had been going around for some time about old Elsie and the Reverend, and neighbors noted that on the morning of Elsie's husband's funeral, who was a hard-working coal miner, Reverend White, he was sitting with Elsie on the porch swing, comforting her by rubbing her face, her arms, and her breasts.
Nice.
The Reverend was revealed to have bought arsenic 3 different times, and so the affair was uncovered, and the murder of Height's wife and Sweeten's husband. Now, both were initially tried, found guilty, and jailed, but Elsie Sweeten was later acquitted after a second trial. The murderous affair was considered a bit of an ill scandal, if you can believe such a thing, and was talked about by residents for decades to come. Following the trial, Elsie moved to Chicago and was remarried twice. Lawrence Height, though, the old Reverend, he was released on parole March 28, 1952, after serving 27 years in jail. So, no bueno for either of them. I wonder if they ever met. Now, that should have been the darkest chapter in Ena's history, if it wasn't for the story we're gonna get into. The Dardeen family. Or rather, it's the way their story ended more than 60 years later, in the 80s, when Ena was only home to about 400 odd folk living there. In 1986, the Dardeen family was made up of 29-year-old Russell Keith Dardeen, 30-year-old Ruby Elaine, both of whom went by their middle names, oddly enough, and their son, 2-year-old Peter Sean. Prior to 1986, Keith had been a long-time native resident of Mount Carmel in Wabash County, Illinois, which is about an hour and a half from where he was living in Ena. Elaine, she hailed from Albion, again not too far away. They were all from this area in southern Illinois. That year, 1986, after Keith had completed his training to begin a well-paid job as a water treatment operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District, look at you, they had a big facility close to Ena. And also, though, one of the other reasons they wanted to move to Ena was, well, it was this effort to escape the growing dangers of big city living, folks, you know yourself. So, Keith purchased a large trailer, which sat on a patch of land he had rented from a couple who had a farm, also near Ena. Elaine, being a bright owl spark, she was quickly able to find work in the area at an office supplies store in Mount Vernon. Things were going well for the young couple. They had this brand new home in 1986, and by the way, just so you get a description of Keith and Elaine, not to be mean, because they are the victims in the story, but Keith, 29, he looked well into his 40s. Neither of them were... People did age differently, didn't they, back in the day? What's the deal with that? Sure, smoking and drinking. Good old days. Keith and Elaine, when they weren't at work, they were heavily involved in their small Baptist church. They especially connected over music, Keith singing the vocals, Elaine playing the piano in the church's musical ensemble and choir. As I said, the move to Ina, 1986, was going well at the start. By the middle of 1987, less than a year on from the family first moving to the area, Keith was, he was no bueno about living here. He wanted to move back to Mount Carmel, even if it meant losing his job, his well-paid job as a water treatment operator. The reason for the decision to get away, when they'd only just moved here, was the recent and very sudden spike in violent crime, especially murder in the area. There had been about 15 murders in the past couple of years in the county, and Ina, home to about 400 people in the 80s, that's a lot of murders in the area if you're looking for, pound for pound, population density, population percentage. It was a lot of murders, a shit ton. Evidently not so safe. I mean, geez Louise, the reason he moved here was for the quiet and safe country life. You gotta be shitting me. Also, the revelation that Elaine was pregnant with the couple's second child, their first daughter, not that they knew that yet, it made the desire to move on all the more overwhelming. They had to go. One kid, another on the way. Let's get out of here. The murder rate is climbing and, not to get ahead of myself, but they're gonna contribute to that. Keith, he was protective of his family, close to the point of paranoia. And, I mean, when you have that many murders in the area, like, sure, why wouldn't you be? It was getting to the point where you look at him sideways, or his family, his wife sideways, and he'd blow your head off your shoulders. His family would later recount an occasion in which a woman had come to the Dardeen's front door of their trailer. The woman had broken down, and she was requesting, can I use your house phone? Keith was so untrusting by this point that he only let the woman use the phone through the front door. Now, it might seem extreme, but hindsight would later prove he'd been right after all. So with Elaine being 7 months pregnant, it was time to go. Keen to giddy up, Keith put the trailer up for sale, with plans to move before kiddo numero 2 was borno. The weekend of the 14th to 15th of November, the family visited Elaine's side of the family, spent some time with them before coming back home to the trailer with the for sale sign on it, and Elaine called her family when they made it back, November 16th, 1987, to let them know they were safe and sound. That would be the last time anybody would hear from the Dardeen family. 2 days later, it was November 18th, 1987, and Keith's father, Don Dardeen, he received an unexpected call from his son's supervisor at the Rend Lake facility. Keith, a normally reliable and stand-up guy, he hadn't shown up for work as scheduled. I mean, Keith was such a reliable guy that they called his dad when he hadn't shown up. It was so out of character for him to miss work and not to call. He would only, not be here if something was very, very wrong. A supervisor had even driven to Keith's trailer and was knocking on his door. Zip answer to those knocks. Now, Don, he hadn't heard from his son either, and also received no answer when he called his son's home number. It wasn't like Keith to be out of reach. And so after getting Keith's mother, Joanne Dardeen, up to date, Don called the Ina Sheriff's Office and quickly arranged to meet deputies at the Dardeen's place. You've got this young family, super paranoid, weren't showing up for work, in an area with an extremely high murder rate. Immediately, they were feeling like shit's about to go down. Now, the house was located between Illinois Route 37 and the Union Pacific Railroad, just a little north of the Franklin County line. Sort of isolated place, to give you a picture. They had no neighbors, surrounded by farming fields. Upon the arrival of deputies who waited for Don, the Dardeen's home seemed completely ordinary. There were no outward signs of any sort of disturbance there. But when Don arrived, he saw right away that Keith's car, a red 1981 Plymouth, it was missing from the driveway. So immediately, hey, maybe they just drove off somewhere. Maybe they're out of town. Maybe they had some kind of emergency and had to go to the hospital. You don't know. Expecting to find the house empty, but still taking the necessary precautions, the deputies took Don's keys and let themselves in. They made their way through the house, everything seeming like sort of normal, nothing out of place, until they came to the bedroom. And in that bedroom, folks, like what they saw, it would change anybody's life forever. It was nothing short of a massacre. 3 bodies seemed to have been tucked into Keith and Elaine's bed. The room, it was covered in blood spatter and pieces of human flesh. Elaine had been bound and gagged with duct tape. before she was brutally beaten to death. The murder weapon left right there on the floor, and it was soaked in blood. A bloody baseball bat. That baseball bat had been a birthday present to young Peter Sean Dardeen from Keith to mark the toddler's second birthday earlier that year. The carnage in the Dardeen's home, it was unreal. Immediately upon discovering the horrific scene, the primary suspect was, well, the only one of the Dardeens not present at the scene, Keith. Now, folks, it's about to get pretty gruesome. And I'm guessing you're probably thinking, hey, didn't I just say there was 3 bodies there? Yeah. 3 people were tucked in to the bed. Elaine, her young son Peter, and when I say the carnage was carnage, I really meant it. Rather than Keith, who they didn't find in the house, the third body actually belonged to the youngest of the Dardeen family, their newborn daughter, Casey. Yeah, folks, just a beep, beep, beep content warning in 3, 2, 1. As the heavily pregnant Elaine was being beaten by her attacker, the assault had triggered premature labor, an evolutionary mechanism, or basically it's like a last-ditch effort to save the life of the baby when it seems like the mother's life is under imminent threat. So a heavily pregnant woman's body will force her to give birth early so that hopefully the baby can survive. Baby Casey, as her parents intended to name her, lived only minutes before she was also savagely beaten to death with the same weapon that had just killed her mother Elaine and her brother Sean. The other agony that Elaine must have experienced in her final moments is pretty unimaginable, as is the level of evil, like fucking hell, truly evil, to do what was done to a woman, her 2-year-old son, and her minutes-old baby. And despite Don Dardeen insisting, he insisted that there was no way his son could have done something like this, the police only had the scene and very minimal evidence to go on. Keith was missing. His beloved red Plymouth was missing. His family had no known enemies. Everybody else was dead. This was a super paranoid family who lived in the middle of nowhere. 2 + 2 = Keith must have done it. The manhunt began. A search was launched with all the resources of the Ena Sheriff's Department, which, let's be honest, not a whole lot of resources, but it was all being redirected, right, in an effort to bring Keith in as quickly as possible, hopefully before the news of the Dardeens being massacred in their own home became public knowledge. A SWAT team was dispatched to Mount Carmel and Keith's mother's house, basically hoping, is he here? Joanne Dardeen, his mom, is he with you? Nope. So Joanne Dardeen found out about the deaths of her daughter-in-law and grandchildren in the worst way possible, at the end of a SWAT team member's gun. Bulletins were sent out to every law enforcement agency in the area. Missing Keith Dardeen, possible family slayer. And despite the police being eager for the word to not spread, it sort of has a habit of, just sort of doing that. However, not long after the horrifying and gruesome discovery was made, it was time for the next one. Keith's beloved red missing Plymouth was not missing anymore. It was found about 10 miles from the murder scene trailer. The car's interior was drenched in blood, and the location of the car itself was possibly a tease or a challenge to the police. His car was found parked outside the police station in Benton, Illinois, south of the primary scene at the Dardeen's trailer. Again, like 10, 11 miles away. The killer left the vehicle outside a police station. I mean, come on. That definitely seems to be like taunting. But the thing was, Keith was still missing. So whose blood was that? The next day, authorities would find themselves owing Keith and his family a huge apology. See, less than 24 hours after the scene in the Dardeen family trailer was discovered, hunters, they stumbled across Keith's butchered remains in a wheat field close to the first scene, just a little south of the Jefferson-Franklin County line near Rend Lake College. And Keith's fate, out here, in this field, had been every bit as violent and seemingly as personal as his wife's, his son's, and his almost unborn daughter's. Now, his actual cause of death was gunshot. 3 in total, but Keith's body had been pretty desecrated. He had a lot of blunt force trauma, probably due to that same baseball bat. And, get this, Keith's penis. it was cut off, which, folks, yikes. Yeah, yikes. Why the fuck would you? That's personal, and that's cutting a dick off, my friends. I'm somehow doubting he did all this shit to himself. Now, there was some dispute, initially at least, between Dr. Richard Garretson and Dr. Robert Lewis, who were the coroners of Jefferson and Franklin counties, respectively. The family were killed in one, Keith was killed or at least found in the other. Jurisdictions, whoa! One doctor believed that gunshots had killed Keith, while the other attributed his death to blunt force trauma to the head. And the Dardeens had all been killed within the space of likely about an hour of each other, around 12 hours before they were found. Keith killed somewhere in the region of 24 to 36 hours before his body was found, so likely very close to the time his wife and children were also killed. Basically, the whole family was probably killed at the same time, though there could have been a bit of time, a couple of hours, between when Keith was killed and his family was killed. His body being found where it was, it meant it was sort of hard to say exactly what had happened. And the killer, get this as well, they had taken their time at the house. They had taken their time to pose the family, tucking them into bed. They cleaned up, they cleaned up blood spatter, they had cleaned up a lot of the scene after themselves, except in the bedroom. I mean, I don't know, it seems to sort of indicate that Keith may have well been dead, having been killed first, and then the killer took a lot of time with the rest of his family. Now, no drugs nor alcohol were found in the bodies, neither were known to use drugs other than weed occasionally. A small amount was found in the home. And again, the time of the deaths was most likely around the same time. It's chilling that somebody could do that, but I mean, was it one person? Was it more? Did somebody break in? Which they would have needed to do, as Keith, remember, uber paranoid guy, wouldn't even let a girl come into his house to use the phone. So did they come in, hold Keith hostage, kill his family, took them into bed, then put Keith in his own car, drive him, murder him in the car because it was covered in blood, cut his dick off, then dump him in a field, then drive back, park the car outside a police station? This is too fucked up to even think about. And the killer, as I said, they did a good job cleaning up. No fingerprints were found on the baseball bat, the car, no hair, no nothing. This had to have been extremely personal. And if not, and it was some rando, I mean, that sort of is even scarier. If it was a random attack, they had valuables in the house. They weren't crazy rich or anything, but they had cash, they had jewelry, they had a VCR machine, which in 1987, hubba, all was still there. Nothing was stolen. News of the Dardeen family massacre and the shocking level of brutality spread. It spread across Ena, then Illinois, and finally it became a national news story, spreading like wildfire. And remember, where they were living, Ena, a tiny place. Only about 400 odd people lived there. Having taken place at the arse end of the 1980s, the timing was ripe for rumors of Satanists and devil worshippers being involved. You know yourself, all the good ones, all the good lads, the top dogs, the hits. But in reality, nothing to indicate any sort of ritualistic aspects to this murder. They brought in experts. They said nothing here religious, anti-religious, anything like that. There's no ceremonial aspects, no weird occult symbols or missing organs, or no missing personal items either. The motive of robbery, again, quickly ruled out thanks to the presence of the Dardeens' personal items still being at the scene, including, as I said, several expensive ones. Briefly, the idea of it being drugs related or actually gambling related, a gambling debt, was sort of considered thanks to several sports betting papers being found at the scene. Had Keith been killed because of a debt he owed? Was he trying to raise money to move out of Ena as quickly as possible and owed a little bit too much money to the wrong crowd? But this was eliminated almost immediately by Keith's mother, Joanne, who told police that her son was a real tight ass. He was so tight with cash, he would never accrue any sort of debt. He never played around with any sort of money. She even told the police that he was raising money for their children's college fund by reselling 50-cent cans of soda with a small markup at work. Like, seriously, he's going into his job, his well-paid job, and reselling cans of soda. That's a guy who's counting every little nickel. Other local rumors of a drug debt seem to have sprung up because, again, there was news of a small bit of weed found at the home. But again, the police were quick to dismiss that. The reality was very different to what people were thinking. The weed, very, very small amounts. Maybe they had a joint or two, like, once a year. The idea of a debt being resolved by brutally murdering the debtor and not taking any of their valuables, including a TV and VCR, both in plain view of anyone entering the home, just did not make sense. Surely they would take something to recoup their losses if the Dardeens owed money to the wrong crowd. The possibility of a sexual motive had also been long ruled out. Elaine, she hadn't been sexually assaulted or anything before her death. There was one idea of it possibly being homosexual related because of Keith's dick being cut off. The police did ask Joanne and she said no, there was nothing, no kind of weird sexual stuff was going on at home. Well, that she was aware of anyway. Honestly, going through theory after theory, it just seemed like the family were all brutally murdered for seemingly no reason whatsoever. Authorities, especially the district attorney, state police, and the Ena Sheriff's Office, they were utterly desperate to solve the Dardeens' murders. Not only because of the level of brutality involved, but the growing level of pressure from the public thanks to the recent spike in violent crimes. Remember, homicides had been on the up and up. I mean, Illinois itself had seen a shocking spat of horrific crimes in the mid to late 80s. Shit was going to hell in a handbasket around this time. And the lack of any apparent personal motive in such a seemingly personal crime, I mean, it not only had the police stumped for a suspect to pin it on, but also had the public growing more and more fearful. Robert Lewis, the Franklin County coroner, always believed that there was a very personal motivation behind the crime, and that the Dardeens hadn't been chosen at random. As always happens in the United States, though, in such circumstances, boy oh boy, somebody's gonna make a bit of money. Gun and lock sales through the roof. People became less and less trusting of one another, and socializing, even between people you knew, became less and less common. People who grew up in the town at this time, they would later say they couldn't sleep at night. They would have to get up in the middle of the night, turn all of the lights on in the house. A total of 30 full-time detectives were assigned to work on the Dardeen case, and every little lead, even with the most tenuous possibility of being true, was followed up on. Despite conducting more than 100 interviews, and even the arrest of one man who was later released, eventually every lead just dried up. Despite the police dedicating all their resources and significant manpower, they couldn't even answer the question of how many people had been there, how many killers were they looking at. There had been a huge amount of effort in the killings, as you are aware, and then the cleanup, right? They had nothing to go on, no fingerprints, a lot of the crime scene had been cleaned up. It was so perfectly staged. The bodies being in the bed tucked in, the bedroom covered in blood, the rest of the house spotless. The car being covered in blood, but the outside spotless. That sort of led police to believe that there must have been more than one killer. But the more leads that led to dead ends, the more police began to believe they were looking for a repeat offender. Person who did this, they have to be a serial killer. And while serial killers and mass murderers working in pairs or groups isn't unheard of, it is pretty uncommon. The famous ones being like Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, Fred and Rose West, the Hillside Stranglers. Slowly, as time went on, the hysteria, both national and local, began to die down, and the Dardeens case grew colder. That's not to say it had been forgotten about completely, though. Joanne Dardeen, Keith's mom, she would not allow the case to be forgotten, and Keith's mother has continued to fight for her son and her son's family ever since. For almost a decade after the killings, Joanne stayed in regular contact with the detective assigned for her son's case. She even chased up on tips and leads she herself uncovered. At one point, she managed to start a petition, pre-internet, that gained more than 3,000 signatures, which she presented to the producers of popular news shows like Unsolved Mysteries, hoping they would do a segment on her son's murder to keep the word going. However, her efforts were turned down. In 1997, roughly 10 years after the murders of her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, Joanne Dardeen suggested there may have been a drug element, just not the one people had thought earlier. She proposed, this is her new theory, that someone had wanted Keith to sell drugs for them, but he had refused, leading to the killings. Now, there's never been any evidence to suggest this might be the case, and honestly, I think it's a case of a grieving mother being so deeply scarred by the loss of her, son and family that she just wanted some reason for why it happened. And I mean, who could blame her? But I mean, if you're looking for somebody to sell drugs for you, not sure if Keith Dardeen would be the clear and obvious choice. Joanne would later say, "I've always wanted to know every detail. Some people may think that's gory, but when someone does something, I want to know why." A year or so later, the Unsolved Mysteries team, who initially turned down airing a segment on the case, they relented. They covered the story in a 1998 episode, but it didn't spark any new leads or theories really about the case. As year on year continued to pass without any resolution to the Dardeen family massacre, the serial killer angle seemed to be more and more, well, the most likely story here. In 1999, an early frontrunner was the possible involvement of the Railway Killer, aka Angel Maturino Resendez, aka Rafael Resendez Ramirez. So this guy, Rafael, the Railway Killer, let's just call him, he handed himself to the Texas Rangers after becoming one of the state's and country's most wanted men. He traveled around the United States, living as a hobo, as you can imagine, hopping from train to train, sort of like Karl Panzram did as a youth. And he would take any opportunity that presented itself to claim a victim, usually via blunt force trauma, like what happened to the Dardeens, before jumping onto the next train out of town. Now remember, I mentioned in passing, the Dardeens' home, it was slap bang next to a busy railway. So police briefly suspected he could be the guy. I mean, the chances of him getting a train through this area were not that remote had he popped off the train, done a bit of killing, then popped back on. But despite their best efforts, he was never linked to the crime by any, actual tangible evidence. It really seems like Keith was the main target. And the others, his wife and kids, they were simply sorta just like there. Was Keith killed first? And then the killer, or killers, they went back in to finish the job in, the most brutal way possible. If that was the case, and Elaine knew something was wrong, no phone calls were made from the home. And although it seems like Keith and the family were killed around the same time, there could possibly have been at least a good few hours between Keith being killed and his family being killed. Possibly up to 12 hours, which is a long-ass time. Honestly, police found the couple were doing nothing, openly or secretly, which would have led them to be involved with some shady shitbag. No affairs, no money issues, drugs, any of that. It seemed to be a completely random killing, which to be fair, is the scariest shit of all. The Dardeen story ends, or at least pauses for now, with another serial killer out of Texas, and someone we've actually covered before, if you can believe it, Tommy Lynn Sells. We did an episode on him ages ago, lads, so you know what, go listen to that earlier episode, but he is what I like to call a real piece of shit. On New Year's Eve, 1999, Sells attacked two young girls in their beds, cutting their throats in a town near Del Rio, Texas. One of the girls miraculously pulled through, and she was able to help identify, and then later convict Sells of murder and attempted murder. That crime landed him on death row, and it turned out was far from the only crime he'd committed, if you can believe such a thing. Sells had earlier killed another girl in similar circumstances in San Antonio, the very same year, in fact, in 1999, a crime that landed him another death sentence, but was far from the end of the confessions to come. While awaiting trial, Tommy Lynn Sells began fessing up to leaving a long trail of dead in his wake, as he, similar to the Railway Killer, he traveled around the states, hopping freight trains. He would sustain himself through day work, or theft, depending on the opportunities that offered themselves, depending on the place. For years, Sells didn't stop moving, and admitted that he couldn't even remember how many people he had actually killed over the years. He'd completely forgotten where they were, when they were, anything he could remember. Now, it's believed it's probably minimum 10, but probably a lot more, but the lack of details made it very hard to confirm Sells' responsibility for many of the murders he very likely committed, even when he openly claimed to have done it. He would say he had done it, but just couldn't remember the details, so, hard to actually pin it on him. And when he was arrested and admitted to killing people all around the United States, police agencies, they came forward with their unsolved murders, hoping to be able to pin it on Tommy Lynn Sells. One of those would be the Dardeen family murders. See, Sells, he definitely spent time in Jefferson County, Illinois, where the Dardeens lived, but whether he had actually ever met the family, it's simply unprovable. But just the fact that he rode the railways, that would have taken him through Enid, for sure. But, that's far from any proof. However, Sells himself claimed on more than one occasion that it was indeed himself who'd killed the family. He was like, yeah, the Dardeens, sure I did that, look at me. Now, at first, many, including Joanne Dardeen, believed it was very possible and even probable that Sells was responsible for the family murders. But over time, people have begun to, are you sure though? Did he though? Joanne would say in an article from the Chicago Tribune, I'm just sure that he is, responsible. And she called the police almost every day throughout the years of fruitless leads. She just desperately needed some kind of explanation. Texas authorities, they were fairly sure he did it. Here's a quote from the article from one of the officers there. There definitely seems to be a sincere desire on his part to try right some of the wrongs as much as he can. He gave such specific details there, our guys are convinced that he's a prime suspect in the case. So what was the story he told? Well, despite several key figures familiar with the case, including Jefferson County State's Attorney Douglas Hoffman, strongly believing that Sells was their man, the accusation doesn't come without a lot of doubt, largely caused by the varying accounts given by the man in question. Remember, Tommy Lynn Sells, he's killed a lot of people, but he can't remember half the time where and when. In his first rendition of events, around the year 2000, shortly after he was first imprisoned, Sells claimed that he met Keith Dardeen at a truck stop somewhere near Mount Vernon, where they got chatting and Keith ended up inviting Tommy Lynn Sells home for dinner. Sells went with him, and after the meal, he had been intending to move on, go back to the railway. But he ended up flying into a rage with Keith because he had offered himself and his wife Elaine up for some sexy fun times. Sells, infuriated by the implied homosexuality in the offer, claimed then that he forced Keith at gunpoint to drive the Plymouth out to the field where his body would later be found, killing him and mutilating him in the car before dumping him out. He then returned to the trailer, killed Elaine and Peter because they could have identified him. During this account, he famously said, quote, I was just so pissed off that I took it to the maximum limit. Rage don't have a stop button. So in this first version, he claims that he met him at a truck stop, went to the house, had dinner with the Dardeens, and then when Keith said to him, you want to have a threesome? Sells blew a gasket and murdered the entire family. Now, and in this first version, he didn't directly claim to have killed baby Casey, but he did seem to sort of skirt around it. In his second version, most of the details were the same, but the truck stop where he met Keith, it changed to a pool hall, along with a bunch of other, changed smaller details. By the time it came to telling the story again, Sells seemed to have forgotten many of the details and couldn't keep the story straight at all, including doing away with his meeting with Keith altogether. This time, the family had simply been unlucky and were picked at random thanks to the for sale sign that Tommy Lynn Sells said he saw outside their trailer. Under the guise of being a prospective buyer, Sells wormed his way into the Dardeen home, and after drinking a beer with Keith, he subdued Keith before binding Elaine and Peter with duct tape. He then drove Keith out to the field where he cut off his dick and told him he was going to take it back to Elaine. Then he shot him to death, tossed the body out, and drove back to the Dardeens, where he raped and beat Elaine and killed the children. He then cleaned up, took the car to Benton, where he dumped it outside the police station. Okay, outside of the differences between versions, and that's 3 different stories he's told at minimum, there are quite a few issues with each recounting of the story, whichever one you take. For a start, right, he seems to get many details objectively wrong. Others he got wrong, but then he would adjust quickly. Most likely he was taking cues from whoever he was telling the story to. It seems like the investigators, maybe they were even feeding Tommy Lynn Sells information about the case, hoping to just get it closed. There was also the matter of whichever version you're hearing, the truthfulness, it sort of always relied, right? No matter which version Sells told, every story relies on Keith inviting Tommy Lynn Sells, an unknown 22-year-old man who looked rough as shit because he lived on railways, into the home. This was the same man who was so afraid for his family's safety that he wanted to move out of the area he'd moved into less than a year before. The same man who had earlier refused to let a single woman into the house to use his phone, and instead had her speak at the door because Keith, he wouldn't let any kind of stranger, man nor woman, into the house. A super paranoid guy. While there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Sells could have very easily acted out the kind of brutality that would leave the family slaughtered in the home, it's hard to say, though, that the evidence is anywhere near solid, and his story just has so many holes in it. He could have done it, but I don't think he did it. And Sells himself would claim that the lack of evidence was a kind of evidence in itself, as in a lot of his murders, there was a lack of physical evidence. I mean, he was only caught for the final crime because one of the girls he cut the throat of survived. It wasn't because of any other sort of evidence. Tommy Lynn Sells has claimed 22 bodies to his name in total, but how many he really killed is unknown. Could be more, could be less. He was a killer, but whether he was the Dardeen's killer is far from certain. There's just no evidence to tangibly tie him to the crime, and every time he retells the story, or retold the story, well, it was different, and just seemed to get details flat out wrong. Ultimately, many still believe the truth about what happened to the Dardeens may have been lost forever, with the execution of Tommy Lynn Sells in 2014 in Texas. Around the year 2000, when the link to Tommy Lynn Sells was first reported, Joanne Dardeen initially believed wholeheartedly in Sells' guilt. But like many in more recent years, she sorta changed her position. Sells was known to make many false claims. He was doomed anyway. Why not get himself some prison cred and some home comforts from grateful detectives and prison officers? Joanne, she had requested to talk to Tommy Lynn Sells about her son's murders prior to his execution, but was turned down, despite Sells apparently being open to talking with her. It wasn't that she necessarily thought he was innocent or guilty, more that she believed he might have had help. That he could have been there murdering her family, and he wasn't there alone. Which is a very possible lead. The Dardeen family murders, they remain unsolved to this day, and with how horrifying they were, it's a very dark and terrifying case. But that's the end of it. For now. Anyway, a case which seems perfectly solvable, but it ain't. Sleep well on that one, folks. Alright, guys, thank you so much for listening to this whole episode of the That Chapter podcast. It means a lot to me and the Warthog, and I'm sure Keith will be on an episode soon, so you'll be talking to him soon too. But until the next one, please take care of each other and yourselves. Because guess what? I love you. Mike out.
Well, the holidays have come and gone once again, but if you've forgotten to get that special someone in your life a gift, well, Mint Mobile is extending their holiday offer of half off unlimited wireless. So here's the idea. You get it now, you call it an early present for next year. What do you have to lose? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Limited time 50% off regular price for new customers. Upfront payment required. $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan. Taxes and fees extra. Speeds may slow after 50 gigabytes per month when network is busy. See terms.